Did you know evolutionists have made many predictions about what we would expect to find if evolution is true? And many of those predictions have turned out to be completely false. And I'm here with Dr. Cornelius Hunter, a biophysicist, who's going to just be talking about one of those false predictions today. Welcome, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to this. So, we're going to talk about a prediction. We're going to talk about a prediction that has turned out to be false. Evolution has generated dozens of fundamental, I would say all of its fundamental predictions, main predictions have turned out to be false. And so I want to say a word about what does it mean to generate false predictions before we get into this particular false prediction, because evolutionists have a whole bunch of responses to this when you tell them about false predictions. So I have this paper online that goes through all these false predictions, a couple dozen. And I start out by giving a list of all the rebuttals that you get, all the pushback you get from evolutionists about their false predictions. And you just kind of need to be aware that it's a theory protectionism is kicking in. They're protecting their theory. They're not exploring the truth. They're not exploring the problems with the theory in a genuine scientific way. They're putting up a fortress. They're putting up, protection around their theory. And one of the pushbacks, one of the rebuttals is, well, we don't believe that anymore. You're presenting a prediction that has long since been dropped. Well, of course it's been dropped because it turned out to be false. There's that rebuttal is actually problematic for another reason, which I'll get back to. Hold that thought. I'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. So you just need to be aware of that. Many years ago, I was reading a book by Niles Eldredge called The Monkey Business. And now Eldredge is a paleontologist, a famous evolutionist. He developed this punctuated equilibrium idea with Gould, Stephen Jay Gould. And he wrote this book, with mainly a lot of paleontology, but he got off into other areas as well. And at one point, he made the statement that the underlying chemical uniformity of life was a severe test that evolution passed with flying colors. Now, I have nothing, against evolution. I have no problem with evolution being true. And by the way, when I say evolution, I need to define that. When I say I have no problem with evolution being true, what I'm referring to is the naturalistic origin of the world. So if God wants to create the world by secondary causes, I got no problem with that. Okay, it's above my pay grade. Whatever he wants to do. So it doesn't bother me if God uses secondary causes. Not a big deal for me. So I have no problem with evolution being true. So it wasn't on my radar screen. I wasn't like, a warrior against evolution or anything. What intrigued me about this whole thing was the claim. So evolutionists make the very high truth claim, and Eldredge included, making these comparisons of evolution to gravity and to the roundness of the earth, to heliocentrism. If you don't believe in evolution, if you don't accept it as a fact, that's tantamount to being a flat earther or to denying gravity, of all things. And this claim goes back to shortly after Darwin. Evolutionists started making this claim in the 19th century. So Eldredge did too, and one of his claims was this underlying uniformity of life. Now, I was just fascinated by this claim, and so I was collecting arguments. I wanted to confirm the claim. I wanted to understand it because I didn't understand how they got there. I knew something about the evidence. I wasn't, an expert in all the evidence. So that set me off on a path to, collecting arguments and collecting the evidence and the arguments. Well, how is it that they know that this is a fact? And the initial readings that I didn't help a lot. Evolutionists are very open about this, and they give you they write about this all the time. And Darwin did whole book. He called it One Long Argument for the truth of evolution. So they're not shy about this, but when you read it, it's not exactly obvious. It doesn't jump off the page. It's go, oh yeah, okay, it's a fact. there's these kind of obtuse, arguments and evidences being made. Oh, wait, okay, I understand the evidence now. How does that make it a fact? So it's a fascinating question of, well, how exactly does this work? So it really isn't the theory so much as the claim about the theory that got me going, and that really you can learn a lot about. You really start to understand what's going on in the theory itself. It gets you into the history of thought, the history of science. I got this, one of those 3x6 work tables, those brown tables you see in conference rooms. And I got a big roll of artist paper, and I covered the whole thing with this white paper, and I taped it down. And I was, and I had stickies all over that thing, and I had charts and flow charts and arguments, delineated out, and timelines. And that was it was my headquarters. And I had this room and all these books. I was going to the library and collecting all these papers and books and magazine articles. It was a fascinating research project, and out of that came my first book, Darwin's God. And I realized that I discovered for myself, I'm not saying I was the first one to know this, but I discovered the metaphysics that's doing the heavy lifting behind this, and the religion, the theology. And you have to understand the theology and the history of theology and to really understand what's going on here. And how, when you go back to Darwin, so I started with contemporary literature, and that brought me back to Darwin. And with Darwin, he's drawing upon all of these kind of givens that had been accepted by then. And you have to understand, where do these givens come from? And that takes you back to the Anglicans and the Lutherans mainly of the centuries prior to that. And then you can go back to the Epicureans of antiquity, and it all starts to fall into place. And so this picture starts to fall into place. I couldn't believe it at first. Is it really true? And the more I investigated, the more it all fell into place. So that was, where I'm coming from. It's not from being against evolution. It's questioning its core claim. So yeah, it's not exactly obvious. It is a heroic theory. I mean, you need to, we should all kind of, even if you're a hardcore Richard Dawkins evolutionist, and I think he has agreed that, yeah, it is a heroic theory. It doesn't exactly jump off the page that the entire world arose by itself. That's not that obvious, right? So we need to have some good evidences for this. I was reading everything I could get my hands on, and here was Eldredge, The Monkey Business, this book that he wrote, and making these claims and saying this thing about the underlying chemical uniformity of life was a severe test that evolution passed with flying colors. Wow. What exactly is the chemical uniformity? I mean, I knew about nucleotides and amino acids, proteins, sugars, carbohydrates. Yeah, there's all species use these. There's the genetic code. All species have this genetic code. There's DNA replication. There's the cell membrane. There's all these things. So he's referring to those sorts of things. Now, he wasn't the only one making this claim. My friend, my late great friend, Michael Ruse, made this claim. Christian de Duve, Nobel laureate, made this claim in their own words. There's this, great test of evolution, this prediction that evolution made. I think it was a retrodiction, not a prediction, but that's fine. They after the cell had been fully understood or better understood, evolutionists came up with this retrodiction. That's fine. And then making this claim that, wow, it's just passed this test with flying colors. Now, this is really interesting because there's two problems, and I didn't understand this at the time. It took me years and years of hard work to realize there's two problems with this claim. We're going to focus on one of the problems here, but I'll just point out there's two problems. One problem is, if you grant the evidence, the claim still doesn't make sense from a scientific perspective. Why, even if it is true that there's this great uniformity the underlying chemical, uniformity across life. Why does that prove evolution? Why is that a prediction of evolution? Well, it's religious, it's theological. That's the power. The power of this is theological. And if you don't believe that, I'll just give you one little hint at this, is that the second problem with the claim is that it's false, scientifically false. And when those falsifications were discovered in the past, recent decades, that never harmed evolution at all. So here you have these leading evolutionists claiming this is this, great prediction of evolution, and it's passed the severe test. I mean, that's a high claim, severe test. And it passes this test with flying colors. Oh, and then it fails a few years later. Well, if it failed, then by modus tollens, the theory fails. But that never happened. You don't see evolutionists running around sweating about this. This is not a problem. It's like, oh, well, we have other ways to explain this. So it wasn't a severe test. It wasn't a prediction. And so where did the power of this idea come from? Why is it such powerful evidence? Well, that's theological. And it goes back to these theological ideas that are so powerful that drove Darwin and drove people of his generation and the centuries before, but also are driving us today in ways that are very deceptive. So there's this enormous deception going on in evolutionary theory. That's what I find so fascinating, and in some ways beautiful. It's a very interesting thing to study. Now, there's this second problem that I just mentioned, which is, well, it's also false. And so why is it false? Well, it's false in many ways. And that's what my paper on the false predictions of evolution goes into, is all these different predictions and how is it that they're false? And very importantly is, what's the result? What happened as a consequence? And I'll get to that in just one second, of what happened in this case as a consequence. But let me give you an example of how you like to have it happen in physics. So Newton comes out with his physics, the Newtonian physics, in the 17th century. And well, it worked really well, except not always. The planet Uranus wasn't following the rules, and it was flying in an orbit that was not what was predicted. So we had a false prediction. Well, what was the result of all this? Well, they figured, some people hypothesized, maybe it was because there's another planet that's perturbing it. And sure enough, they discovered the planet Neptune. So it was Neptune. It was Neptune's fault. It wasn't a bad theory. It wasn't the theory's fault. So it was a false prediction that led to new knowledge, and the theory prevailed. That's what you want to have happen from false predictions. It's like, oh, wow, this is great. We got a smoking gun. We got, the false prediction led to new knowledge. That's not the way it works with these evolution predictions. And we'll see that in just a second here with this one. So this underlying chemical uniformity. What's the problem? Well, let's talk about one of them, which is DNA replication. It's a fantastic chemical uniformity. All cells divide. A healthy growing, well, I shouldn't say all cells, but a healthy growing individual organism it's a multicellular organism, its cells will divide, creating two daughter cells. And cell division is an enormously complex, fascinating topic to study. But one of the things so everything in the cell has to duplicate in order for this cell to divide. And that includes the genome. So the entire genome has to be copied, has to be replicated. And that happens in a very crowded environment in the nucleus. So you have these molecular machines going on, including like DNA polymerase, which is polymerase make many, DNA make many, DNA polymerase. It's going along the DNA and it's making making two versions of the genome. Now, everyone knows that the DNA is a double helix, right? You got a double helix. So it unwinds it and opens it up. What people is less obvious is these two different strands go in opposite directions. So it's kind of like a freeway with, the traffic on the cars are going one way and then the traffic is going the other way on the two different sides of the freeway. The strands are directional. They're not symmetric. They're directional. They go one way, and they go different ways on the two different strands, and they fit together. And so this DNA polymerase machine, molecular machine, has to make a copy. What it does is it opens it up, unwinds it, and opens it, separates the strands, and goes along and grabs nucleotides from the environment and puts them onto the one strand and then the other strand. And so it's making these two single strands into two double strands. There you go. It's duplicating the genome, which is really cool. But the DNA polymerase wants to go in the direction, one particular direction. It also works, according to the direction of the strand. You can't just go in both directions. So on the one strand, it goes in one direction. On the other strand, it goes in the opposite direction. And this makes for a very complicated problem. How is it going to do this? Because when you're unwinding the DNA, it's like a zipper. You're zipping it open at the top here, and you're rolling that zipper up, and it's opening. And so in the one case, the DNA polymerase just simply continues to work, and it continues, and it follows the zipper. It just keeps on going up. But in the other case, it needs to go in the opposite direction. It's going in the opposite direction from the zipper. And so it goes for a little bit, and then it has to hop off and move up and then go for a little bit. And as it does it, there's these other machines that have to get it going, has to prime it to get it going, and has to ligate it when it gets to the end. It has to glue it together. So all kinds of things are going on as this thing is doing that. And this whole discovery is these fragmented approach, these fragments that it's building. They're called Okazaki fragments, after the Japanese researcher who discovered this. And it's fascinating, these Okazaki fragments and the whole DNA replication process. That is an example of what these evolutionists, including Niles Eldredge, were talking about. This incredible uniformity. You find this in all these different species, this same, kind of idiosyncratic, weird DNA replication process. And, a great chemical uniformity that we're finding. Well, it turned out to be all false. There are other modalities that were discovered. Not all organisms follow this, especially viruses. They have other modalities. They don't do the Okazaki fragment method. It gets even more complicated. So that's one huge problem. Another problem is that the machinery, the DNA proteins, this DNA polymerase and the associated machines, they are not homologous across the species, across the different species. Their amino acid sequences are too different to have a common ancestor. Let me take another drink of water here.
And what about the ones in one type of organism? Is the RNA polymerase that does the hopping structurally similar to the one that goes straight? Like the one that just continues to go down the line?
You meant DNA polymerase, not RNA.
Oh, okay.
Because there is an RNA polymerase, and that gets us in a different discussion.
And it's different. Okay.
Yeah. That's for making a copy for using it in normal operations.
Oh, okay. Yes.
So we think that it looks like it's the same DNA polymerase machine. So it isn't a different machine. It's the same machine, but working on the different strands. And so, much to the surprise, and evolutionists admitted this was a surprise and it didn't make sense, was these molecular machines that were doing this DNA replication were not similar across the different species. And that's the whole idea behind this claim, is chemical uniformity. It's got to be similar. There's going to be mutations, there's going to be differences, but they're going to be minor. They're going to be small enough to say these come from a common ancestor. These are homologous. And they weren't. They haven't been. And that was a major problem for evolutionary theory and an obvious failure of this this claim.
For people who are just maybe kind of not getting why this is such a problem, remember that these things, the idea that these structures could come about by natural processes, is already so incredibly improbable that it's just even, it's crazy to even believe that it could happen once. Okay, but so if we're talking about the origin of life, this is an incredibly improbable event. And so then, and so you've got all these structures. So like, then there's supposed to be this tree, right? That like, okay, we came from a common ancestor and then we branched out. And so we would expect that there would be similarities at the base. And when we see that that's not true, that should give us an idea that, hey, maybe these didn't come from a common ancestor. So
right, exactly. That's where we're headed here, at least one of the places where we're headed. Another example that we looked at a few weeks ago is the DNA code. And that's another example of, wow, there's this really idiosyncratic, this bizarre, interesting, fascinating thing called the genetic or DNA code. And it's the same across all species. The problem with that is, again, the molecular machinery that enact the DNA code are not the same. They're different, which is just another remarkable, mind-blowing discovery for evolutionists. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. We were just celebrating about how the DNA code is universal and how it proves evolution beyond a shadow of a doubt. Now we find out that the proteins that make this happen. So when you do the DNA code is used for making proteins. And so you have these tRNA molecules, these little tRNA molecules that have an amino acid on one end. Those amino acids are going to be used for building a protein. Proteins are made of amino acids. It's a long chain of amino acids. So it's the whole idea behind the DNA code, the genetic code, is to code for amino acids. So you're coding for amino acids. These amino acids are being delivered. They're being delivered by tRNAs. After the tRNA delivers its amino acid, it's what? Uncharged. It's spent. It's empty. It no longer has an amino acid. It needs to be recharged. And this is happening in your body all the time. These tRNAs are being recharged. How are they recharged? There's an army of proteins that recognize which tRNA this is and what amino acid it needs. Oh, this one needs alanine. This one needs tryptophan. This one needs isoleucine. This one needs valine. And so they're grabbing the amino acids and they're grabbing the tRNAs and they're recharging them. That's the DNA code. How do I know which amino acid goes on which tRNA that's built into these proteins? They're called amino acid tRNA synthetases. AARS is the abbreviation. They're using an R for tRNA. So amino acid tRNA synthetases. They're synthesizing. They're putting together the amino acid and the tRNA. These are the keys. These are the backstage players that actually do the DNA code, the genetic code, these proteins. And so the whole story is incredibly complicated and really defies an evolutionary explanation. That's a whole other story. We talked about that. But here what we're talking about is this chemical uniformity and how when evolutionists when scientists decoded these proteins and looked at the actual amino acid sequences of these proteins and the genes that code for them, they found out, wait a minute, these are all different. So in bacteria and archaea and eukaryotes, these different species, different groups of species, the amino acid tRNA synthetases proteins are different. Now, this makes no sense at all under evolutionary theory. If you're an evolutionist, this is just mind-blowing. And Gary Olson and Carl Woese at the University of Illinois wrote a great paper on this, and I think it was 2001. And it goes through in great detail all of these deviations, all these differences in the amino acid tRNA synthetases, and with explanations, they go into great attempts to rationalize it or to explain it. how could this have happened? And they're really grasping this paper. Gary Olson taught he was kind of one of the proteges of Carl Woese. Woese was in retirement by the time I got there. I did cross his path once in a while, but Gary Olson taught a comp bio class, which I sat in on, and it was a great class. And Gary went through this evidence in detail in that class. It was really interesting, and to see just the incredible mismatch, the contradiction with the common descent expectation, and really so it was a huge problem, really. Now he presented it as food for thought and grounds for further research, and we have to look into this. Obviously, that's the way evolutionists are going to look at it. But it was an obvious problem for evolutionary theory and a failure of this prediction. So just like the DNA replication, in the DNA replication case, the DNA polymerase and those molecular machines were found to be different across the different species, so too with the DNA code, and especially the AARS proteins, different across. So you have to imagine that, okay, you have this DNA code, which goes all the way back to the LUCA, last universal common ancestor, billions of years ago. And then the code didn't change, but the proteins that enact it did change. That makes like no sense. They would be under purifying selection. They say the code can't change, because if you change the code, you screw up all these proteins. So if the code can't change, you're going to have purifying selection on the molecular machinery enacting the code. Now evolutionists will say, well, you can have changes as long as they don't change the code. And so, but it's too much. The changes are way too much. The explanations that you have to come up with, and this is all in this paper, and I detail this in my false prediction write-up in the paper, as well as my videos on this. The explanations are wild. They're just wild. How could this have happened? They're invoking all kinds of mechanisms that are unknown, that mechanisms that we don't see. For example, horizontal gene transfer. Well, we know horizontal gene transfer is real, but they're invoking horizontal gene transfer on steroids. It's a completely different type of horizontal gene transfer than what we know. It's on steroids. It's just working, and it's all kind of just so stories just to make it work. So, oh, well, we need this change in this protein. Oh, so there must have been a horizontal gene transfer that did that. So they're just, it's all like tailor-made explanations to fit the observables. And they have horizontal gene transfer changing over time and operating across widely dispersed species on the other side of the evolutionary tree, species that are nowhere close to each other, all kinds of things like that. Special cases over and over again, one-offs over and over. So that's not a compelling explanation, not a compelling result. There are other cases we could go into. I mean, another one is the membrane, the cell membrane. Again, you need a lot of lipids, in these cell membranes. The pathway, the biosynthesis, biochemical pathways to synthesize these lipids, those also have these sorts of differences. The whole glycobiology world is just radically different, species specific. There's no chemical. I mean,
what is the glycobiology world?
Yeah, so the biology is significantly built upon glycobiology. Cells use sugars that are embedded in proteins or teamed up with proteins to do all kinds of tasks in the cell. So there's this whole sugar biology. So these protein sugar machines are constructed in the cell, and that construction process is just unbelievably complicated and fascinating. I did a whole video on this, and it critical for biology. I mean, it's just the operation of the cell depends on these molecular machines, and you don't hear that much about this, but it's a huge area of biology, and especially cellular biology. And these machines are heavily species specific. Yes, there's chemical uniformity in the sense of all cells use glycobiology. All cells are entailed glycobiology. Glycobiology is important across all life. Yes, that's true, but that's about as far as it goes. There is all kinds of species specific details of this whole biological world. Proteins, protein families, wildly species specific. There's all kinds of orphans, what they call them, orphans, these unique protein families to a specific lineage or even a specific species. There's no, the chemical uniformity runs out real fast when you look at these details. And so there's no question that this prediction was what? A prediction. There's no question that it was a prediction. This is not, grasping at straws here. This is not tangential. These are leading evolutionary figures who very clearly touted this prediction. In fact, they went so far as to make it an enormous prediction, making high claims. So, no question. Severe test, which it passed with flying colors. The superlatives being used here. So no question this was a prediction. It's in the literature. No question that it has been falsified over and over again in many different ways. So we got a prediction, we got a failure. That right there is an interesting thing. Okay, let's tally that up. Let's get the record book out and keep our records straight for the historians. Now, as I just said,
but can I interrupt here real quick? Because, there's some people will say, well, that just shows the power of evolution, you see, because we know that this shows that these large changes can be made, for different species.
Right. Well, the problem is you end up with these one-off special cases, these just so stories is what we call them. And so it's not the power of the theory. This gets back to what I said a minute ago about the astronomy. If you have a false prediction, in the case of Neptune, this false prediction led to the discovery of Neptune. The theory was intact. The theory was vindicated. Oh, wait a minute. Is the theory wrong? Lo and behold, they discovered Neptune. Oh, what a vindication for the theory. New knowledge was gained. Well, what happened in this case? Now I said a minute ago, evolutionists will say, well, we don't believe that anymore. You're just dredging up old things. Well, no, that rebuttal fails and fails hard, because what's really the question? The question is, what happened? What was the result? Is it a Neptune result? Did you get new knowledge? Or did you simply come up with just so stories? It's the latter, as I just explained in the amino acid tRNA synthetases story. It's just a bunch of one-offs, special cases. Well, that's how it works across the board. In fact, a smattering of papers have come out as a consequence of this, saying, maybe all cells don't come from a shared common ancestor. Now, let me repeat that. Maybe all cells do not come from a common ancestor. That was a monumental forfeiture. That was a forfeiture of common ancestry, common descent. Now, did the peer reviewers jump up and down and say, reject this paper? No. Did the readers go crazy? No. Is it, oh, okay. So what this first of all shows is that common descent is not core to the theory of evolution. common descent can be forfeited without loss, without harm to the theory. Common descent was a secondary hypothesis, a tangential hypothesis that could come or go as needed. It's not core to the theory. Now, if I asked you, what is evolutionary theory exactly? I mean, what is core to the theory of evolution? Most people would say, well, you know, common descent, mutations, gradualism, you know, things like that. No, none of those are core. Everything you were taught by Mr. Nelson in your 10th grade biology class about evolution, or if you're a life scientist, everything you learned in Bio 101 about theory of evolution is not core. All of those things can be forfeited. The ultimate is common descent. And
I wanted to ask about that.
Common descent can be dropped. What was your...
Well, I wanted to ask about this because I have seen like papers that are saying, no, we need to get rid of this idea that life all came from a common ancestor. And they are actually like presenting this idea of like multiple, you know, ancestries. So what is like, is that being mostly accepted now, or like, what's the status of that?
Well, there are so many problems with evolutionary theory and so many false predictions that you can find them in the literature, but they're not widely acknowledged. They get swept under the rug. It's like, well, that's just the way evolution works. I don't mean they're denied. No evolutionist would deny these things, but it's not like they're dwelling. They're not reckoning with the implications. The implications are that the theory becomes more complicated. It loses parsimony because you get all these one-off explanations. As more and more false predictions accrue, you have to put on patches. And so another patch, or we call these epicycles, after all the epicycles that were needed for geocentrism, the Ptolemy's geocentrism. Those, in Ptolemy's case, those epicycles were not patched on over time. They were embedded initially by Ptolemy. But in evolution's case, they're patched on over time. More and more epicycles are attached. More and more explanations, just so stories, are patched on. Evolutionists, you have to understand that evolutionists believe evolution is true. This isn't something that's debated. It's not something that's reiterated. It's not something that they talk about. It's a given. So it really fits the idea of a paradigm. And so you march around doing your work without thinking about, you know, is this true or not? That's not something they're dwelling on. They're just, you know, and so wherever that takes them, however many epicycles they need, it's always justified. So what they need is outsiders to point out, hey, whoa, wait a minute, you're marching down a blind alley here. It's like a marching band going down this alley and there's no turnaround. And they reach the end of the alley and they just kind of hit this wall and they keep on marching and keep on marching and keep on marching. They're in place. And so that was a scene out of Animal House where they did that. And it was hilarious. That's what's going on. And it's a lot like Aristotelianism back in the 16th century and before, where everything was, you know, assumed. They had these truths and they just made up stories to fit their truths. And it got very tiresome. And so outsiders had to come, like Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes, and calling this into question, saying, no, wait a minute, this is not working. It wasn't the Aristotelians that gave up on the idea. And that's the way things work. You don't get people to change their mind. You have to have other people to press forward. So yeah, don't expect evolutionists to, you know, solve the problem here. So the key question on all of these false predictions is, was it a fruitful false prediction, like in the case of the Neptune discovery, or was it something that just led to more epicycles or denialism or, you know, ridiculous hypotheses and so forth? And that's what happened here. You have just all of the, I talked about the horizontal gene transfer on steroids, but then I also talked about the forfeiture of common descent. And which is, I mean, that's an enormous failure, an enormous theory fail, because that, for many people, was one of the most important, tenets of evolution. They hear this, oh, well, let's just toss that. Now, I'm not saying that's an easy thing for evolutionists to do. And you ask the question, well, what? So most evolutionists will just say, well, no, that those papers just suggesting that common descent, might be dropped, and we just ignore that. That's not a problem.
Andrew would like us to be specific about which papers we're talking about. Do you know off the top of your head? I have them in a file over here, but it would take me a minute to dig them out.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just look at my false prediction number 2 in my false predictions paper, because I have at least one. There's one in there. I think it's a 2021 paper. Maybe I can dig it up right now as we're talking.
And Andrew, I would recommend going back. Remember, you did that debate on my channel with Peter, and he brought those papers forward. So if you go back to that debate, he had several sources cited there.
So yeah, it is 2021 Biosystems. The title of the paper is it possible that cells have had more than one origin? That's one paper, one example of that. Another one is the Leapy paper from 1999. Eugene Koonin is last author on this, 1999. The nucleic acids research. The title is Did DNA Replication Evolve Twice Independently? And so there's another, like, well, gee, I guess this just isn't, it isn't this chemical uniformity. But if you look at my paper, you'll see you can get these exact references. So what you really need to do is look at the outcome, look at the results of these false predictions, and see, was this knowledge producing, or was it really just more of a tax code, more patches on a theory, more complexity, more loss of parsimony? And what you find is, it's the latter. And the failures are, it fails so hard, so hard. The glycobiology world, the protein family world, there's so many protein families that do not fit common descent, that are species or lineage specific. And these mechanisms that we talked about, the DNA replication, the DNA code, that do not obey this at all. So it's really a massive fail. And so you really need to look at, the theory. What I do in my paper is I look at theory virtues as a way of evaluating theories. What are the theory virtues? And one of them is fruitfulness, internal consistency, et cetera, et cetera. And what do these false predictions lead to in terms of that? If you took the Neptune discovery and you looked at those theory virtues, it would be a home run. It's like, oh, this is great. I love it. A false prediction that was a good false prediction. So you have to decide whether these false predictions are good or not so good. And you find out with these evolution false predictions, they're not good at all. They fail, and they fail hard, and they don't help.
Yeah, and like, for example, I know when I was looking into topoisomerase, and one of the interesting things is that a lot of these structures that are totally different in structure do the same function in different cells. And so, like topoisomerase, which every organism that we know of needs topoisomerase to live. But the topoisomerases are so different in structure that they say they had to evolve separately like 5 times. And it's not easy to say, like, you can't put them into a tree because it doesn't make sense. You'll have, one topoisomerase that exists in one organism that's also in another organism that's like totally separated on the supposed family tree. So it doesn't make sense.
That is another great example. It's just, there's so many of these, and that's a great one. So the whole idea of this chemical uniformity of life, no, it's not there. It's not there on many different levels, both the the actual molecules themselves, but also these mechanisms, the pathways, the synthesis pathway, biochemical synthesis pathways, and the other mechanisms like DNA replication and DNA code. So it's fascinating, all the different ways. Let me count the ways that this fails. It just fails over and over again. Now, a minute ago, Rebekah, you asked, well, what about, what evolution's, doing everything? I want to give another explanation for why these failed predictions aren't that important. I mean, the obvious one that I talked about is theory protectionism. These are people who are devoted to the theory. They've spent their lives, their careers are committed to the theory. So obviously there's going to be resistance. Obviously they're going to be having theory protectionism at play. But another reason why these false predictions are not that important to evolutionists is, remember that you have to understand, for them, evolution is true. It's so hard to wrap your head around that if you're not in that world. For them, evolution is true. You cannot downplay that. Don't dilute that. Don't try and understand that within your own worldview, that it is a different worldview. It is true. If you can get your head into that, then you can realize if there is a false prediction, it doesn't harm the theory. It cannot harm the theory because evolution is true. So the obvious result is, we need to come up with an explanation for this. And it doesn't matter how complicated the explanation is, how convoluted, how ridiculous the explanation is. We need to drop common descent. Okay, let's work on this. So if common descent is not core, and gradualism, by the way, is not core, and all the other kind of things you learned in 10th grade are not core to the theory, what is? What is core to evolutionary theory? What is it that cannot be sacrificed? If you say that, you're not an evolutionist. You're not going to get your paper published. You're not going to get your grant money. You're not going to get your letters of recommendation. You're not going to get your postdoc appointment. You're not going to get your faculty position. You're not going to get tenure, the whole thing. If you say that, what is that? What is it that gets you kicked out? Because denying common descent isn't one of them. And denying gradualism isn't one of them. And denying the power of mutations isn't one of them. All those things, I can show you papers upon papers that say all those things. And they've been peer-reviewed by evolutionists. They're written by evolutionists. They're read by evolutionists. And nobody's got their hair on fire. It's all fine. What's core to evolutionary theory? What is unforfeitable? What
the natural processes. They can't give up the natural processes.
Bingo. Naturalism. Naturalism is the core of evolutionary theory. You cannot forfeit naturalism. And then the question is, why is that? What is it that brought us to that? And this is where you get into history. The history of science, the history of theology, the history of thought, and you get into philosophy and theology to understand this. Well, how did this come about? And it's a multifaceted story. It isn't just one person. It isn't just one particular doctrine. But it comes out of theology. The theologians and the philosophers enforced this. And that's why evolution is a religious theory. It doesn't follow the science. The science is window dressing. Evolution is driven by and mandated by, enforced by theology. So this is a case where theology is the driver. It's commanding the science. The science is the handmaiden. The science is doing the bidding of theology. And all of these evolutionists are guilty of this. I'll use that strong word, guilty of this, because you are enforcing theology. And the fact that they don't understand that and they don't acknowledge that talks to the deception that's at play here. A very, very powerful deception. So this is this whole nother world, an explanation you have to get into to understand evolution. So these false predictions are important. And this paper I have on these false predictions to demonstrate the scientific failure, but they don't tell the full story. Because you're going to say, well, why does it sustain? No theory could sustain this level of false prediction. No theory would ever stand up to this, right? Because most theories are scientific.
Right. And so, but what do you say to people like Andrew? Because now his response is, well, but naturalism is the core of all science. Do you agree with that statement?
So then you get into, okay, so what do you want your science to be? And Andrew obviously wants his science to follow naturalism. Okay, I do too. So we share a common bond there, Andrew, or I'm on the same side as you there. I don't want to do non-naturalism in my science. There's two other things to think about when you have to decide what is your science. So does your science entail completeness? Does your science entail completeness? And the other one is, does your science entail realism? So
what do you mean by completeness?
I'm going to explain these, but I want to get this out in front, because you cannot go around making these statements carte blanche without taking responsibility for the whole picture. You have to account for the whole picture. Otherwise, you are deceiving people, probably deceiving yourself. So we got three things here: naturalism, completeness, and realism. Most scientists, certainly most evolutionists, assume, without even thinking about it, completeness and realism and naturalism. And you can't do that. You cannot do that. You have made a fallacy. So what is completeness? Rebekah asks. Completeness means my theory is unbounded. I can explain everything. I don't have areas there are no phenomena that I have to, push aside and say, well, I don't do that. So evolutionary theory claims completeness. Evolutionists, they don't, and they don't say this, they don't think about this a lot, but evolutionary theory has no bounds. It doesn't stop anywhere. It entails geology, the formation of the Earth, the formation of the solar system. The naturalism knows no bounds. I'm talking about the naturalism aspect here. The formation of the galaxy, the formation of the cosmos in general, the formation, the origin of people, the origin of the brain, the origin of consciousness. I mean, there's nothing that is not available, open to evolutionary explanation. Now, Francis Bacon, for many the father of modern science, his ideas evolved a little bit, so I'm not going to make broad claims about his thought, but at times he argued against completeness and argued for there are certain things that science should not address. He would have said consciousness would be one of them. So there are certain things that just is not within the purview. Science should be improving our lives. He saw science as for the defense of the country, for the improvement of the economy, agriculture, building bridges, all good stuff. Science should investigate all that stuff. And it does. But if everything is open to you, then that's a big claim. Now, the other one was realism. René Descartes, for example, argued that, I like naturalism, but I have to admit that some solutions, some explanations that are naturalistic aren't going to be real. They're not going to be a true explanation of reality. They're not going to be approximately true. They're going to be false. They're still useful. I mean, the flat Earth theory is a wonderful theory, a wonderful hypothesis, a wonderful model. It gets used all the time. No one thinks that it's true. So the idea of realism and anti-realism is a well understood, well used concept. You need to understand when you are mandating realism and when you aren't. If your science does not mandate realism, that allows you a lot of flexibility. You can have useful fictions and you can do science without mandating that what you're talking about is true. Evolutionists don't do that. They claim realism. What we're talking about is not a useful fiction. It's not just a model. This is true or approximately true. We may be wrong sometimes. We have to mend that. We have to fix it up. But the idea is true or approximately true. That's realism. So evolutionists are claiming realism. They're claiming completeness. We can do everything, unbounded. And they're claiming naturalism. Everything must be strictly naturalistic. Now, wait a minute. How do they know these things? How do you know that naturalistic explanations can explain everything, completeness, and all those explanations will be true? That you can't get there from without another. There has to be another assumption. There's got to be something else underwriting that. How do you know that every single phenomena, every known phenomena in the universe is explainable by naturalism? How do you know that?
It's an assumption about reality.
Right, exactly. It is an assumption. The assumption is that's the way reality is because God doesn't get into the world. God is not doing stuff. There aren't non-natural causes. There are no such thing. There is no such thing as non-natural causes in the world. That's the hidden, the lurking assumption behind all this, which is what? Non-scientific. Tell me the experiment that you can perform that shows that. And if the answer is, I got none, then you are not a scientist. And Andrew, that comment is not scientific. When you make those comments, that's not science. That's religion. We can have that discussion, but we need to all understand this is not science. And it is so deceptive because they think it's science. Oh, it's natural. All things must be naturalistic. Science must be naturalistic. If I agree, my science is naturalistic. I don't do non-natural science. All my scientific explanations are got by natural law. But I do not claim realism or completeness. I know that I have to give way somewhere. I cannot assume both of those have that triangle, all three corners of that triangle. I can't assume all those because then I'm doing religion. I'm not doing science. And I don't want to do that. I want to do science. I don't do religion. And you're doing religion. So we're in different worlds. So that's what's going on there. And so the deception is so powerful and it is so deep that people don't even understand.
I know, you're so right, because I've noticed, because like when I started like looking at, the probabilities and everything like that of these things happening by natural processes, I was blown away because even, in Stephen Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell, he talks about how in 1966, mathematicians from MIT were approaching, evolutionary biologists and saying, look, this does not work out. You've got to do something about this theory. This does not work. There's too many combinatorial problems here. Like the math doesn't work. And, when I see the probabilities worked out of some of these things, it just leads you to ridiculous conclusions. I mean, and for those who may be watching who don't know what I'm talking about, if right now I told you I started flipping a coin and 150 times in a row I flipped heads, would you believe that that happened by natural processes? Or are the probabilities so stacked against that you would think that I'm cheating in some way? And so this is only the 150 times in a row is just scratching the surface for the idea of one protein coming about, one small protein coming about by natural processes. And if you try to get life and the diversity of life by natural processes, it's just, there's not enough time, atoms in the universe, and like opportunities for things to happen in all of the universe and the time that has elapsed for this to even have a shot at all. So that's an unreasonable thing to believe. And so sometimes when I see that, and then I think about all the smart people who believe in evolution, I'm like, how can they possibly believe this? Like, how does anyone look at these probabilities and still say, no, evolution must be true? And it has to be, I know they're not stupid, so there has to be something else at work. And I think you've identified what it is at work that causes them to turn off that part of their brain and say, no, I must have, it's a philosophical assumption at the base.
It's the power of theology, the power of religion. It is so much more powerful than science. I mean, it is the giant in the room. Science is this puny little thing. When you bring in religious ideas, those are the ideas that make people, go to war and come up with ridiculous theories, and theories that make them look like fools. This is really, one of these emperor without clothes, the emperor who had no clothes sorts of stories, because when you take the blinders off and you actually look at an anatomy book or a physiology book or a biology book, and you look at how biology is constructed, you realize it is so absurd. The theory of evolution is so absurd, ridiculously absurd. There's no excuse when you actually take the blinders off and actually look at it in just a simple, objective way. This is insane. The idea that this evolved naturalistically by random mutations by itself is a good way to think of it. There's different ways to characterize it. The world arose by itself. The world arose spontaneously. The world arose by natural laws. There's different ways to explain it, but these all mean the same thing, that it arose by itself. And that is so obviously false. Now, people say, well, intuition can be wrong. Oh, I agree. Intuition can be wrong. So let's not take that. Let's not take that as gospel. It could be false. Okay, let's look at the science in detail. Let's look at the actual science. Well, it just gets confirmed over and over again. Yeah, that's true. This is absurd. This doesn't work. It fails over and over and over again. The theory itself spawns false predictions like nothing. You can't believe it. It's always pointing in the wrong direction, always getting fooled, always wrong. It is so obviously absurd. It is incredible. And yet you have, as you say, very smart people, smartest people in the world, who are not merely adhering to it, but enforcing it triumphantly, mandating it, making sure that people don't get jobs, don't get advanced in their career if they don't agree. So it is a very powerful deception at work here, and it is theological. And the fact that they don't recognize, they don't understand the theology that they're under, the deception they're under, talks to the power of the deception, which, by the way, is very standard with deceptions, right? You look at any religious cult, they don't think they're in a cult,
Yes. And that's another thing. I mean, that could be a topic for a different day because of the creepy cult-like behaviors of evolutionists. Like anytime it gets questioned, remember what a theory is. A theory is something that we have been tested and da 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 da. So like
you're anti-science.
Yes. We know evolution is a scientific fact. Everyone knows that. It's like very creepy. It's like they can't take the objections. They have to do like enforcements. Just
you're a creationist.
The dogma. Yes,
he's a creationist. I'm not a creationist. I don't share those views. Evolution is just fine with me.
Now, Andrew said your own example of topoisomerase earlier disproves your assertion on protein evolution there. I don't know what you mean by that, Andrew, because we're talking about topoisomerase is like between depending on which topoisomerase is like 1,000 amino acids to 1,500 amino acids all lined up perfectly so that it can fold and do its function. So that's like flipping the coin 1,500 times and getting heads every single time with never getting a tails. So that's the problem.
Yeah, it is a huge problem. Protein evolution is a significant problem. That's another one of my false predictions. By the way, though, it isn't an exact sequence. So a protein can function just well with a bunch of different sequences. So it isn't, it's if it's 500 amino acids, it's not, the one sequence of 500 amino acids and all the others fail. It's actually a large number of sequences that can work and perform that function. But that large number is dwarfed by the number of possible sequences. So you're in this big room of all the possible sequences that, when I say big, it's, huge, 10 to the whatever, 10 to the, billion, go on and on. The number of possible sequences of a 500 amino acid protein. The number of sequences that could work is, it could be a huge number. It could be like millions and millions. It doesn't matter. You could be millions and millions and millions and millions. It's still a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of all the possible. So finding one of those sequences that works is astronomically difficult. But I just want to point out that if you say it's just one sequence, then evolutionists will jump on that and say, "Oh no, you don't understand, proteins."
Right. Well, but and maybe you can correct me on this too, because I was thinking specifically in terms of the homochirality of those amino acids, because getting them in the right, chirality is like the flipping of the coin.
Right. That problem is another huge problem, but it is usually considered to be a different problem. It's exclusive. Somehow evolution solved that problem with the origin of life. So when you had the origin of life, you had the homochirality solved, and then you had the problem of, okay, let's evolve these proteins. So homochirality is a given at that point. So is another problem, yes. By the way, there's another thing I wanted to clarify. So I've made the point a couple of times in this video that evolution is theological, that it's religious, and that's deceptive and it's powerful and all this stuff. And usually when you say that to people, like 99.99% of the time, when you say that, whether it's an evolutionist or a creationist, doesn't matter, they don't understand what you're talking about, and they assume they know what you're talking about, but they don't. And they'll think you're talking about, atheism. You think it's atheistic. You think it's atheism. And the evolutionists will disagree and the creationists will agree, but they all think that it's atheism or secular humanism, or it's so unlikely that it requires faith. Just like the protein problem, it's so unlikely that it requires faith, so it's religious because it requires so much faith. No. Get off of that. That's not the religion. That's not the theology here. It's way deeper than that. The theology is claims about the attributes of God. Claims about the attributes of God. That's the theology at work. And there's a dozen or more of these that form a kind of a web or tapestry in the history of thought. So there's a lot of different ideas weaving in and out of each other about how God is and how God should be juxtaposed with the world. And they've been around since antiquity. They're very strong. They're very powerful. And that's why, I can say that I'm not a creationist, but if I am allowing for evolution to be false, then that makes me a creationist in the eyes of evolutionists. You are a bad guy if you are allowing that. So when I teach my origins class, I start out by explaining, in this class, we allow evolution to be false. I'm not saying it is false. I'm saying we allow it to be false. That's not okay in evolutionary theory. And I'm also allow it to be true. But I allow it to be false. So creationists don't like it because I'm saying I allow it to be true. Evolutionists don't like it because I'm saying I allow it to be false. But that Yeah. So that's
well,
my.
that's what I love about your methodology, because I actually don't like it when creationists, even though I believe the Bible, I don't like it when the Bible is the starting point, because that doesn't allow for us to like take in truths about reality from other sources, right? Like I don't think we have to figure out even how we get to the Bible as a source. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, so I
Yeah, yeah, of
appreciate
course, of course,
your
of course,
openness. Yeah.
absolutely. And by the way, just for the record, I also believe in the Bible. So it's just that, what do you believe about the Bible? And I believe that the, yeah, I mean, to me, yeah, okay, this is a big story. I probably don't want to go into this is so detailed, but I do believe in the Bible. I believe that we humans are without hope except for Jesus. So Jesus is the only hope that we have. There's no other way that we can get out of this thing. That's what I think the Bible is real clear on. Now, the Bible says other things too, but I just want to clarify that, I'm real that I also share in the belief that the Bible is the Word of God, and Jesus is the only hope. He's the Son of God, and He will return, and all that stuff.
But
It also
you're not
says,
using that as your starting point for figuring out what's true about origins. You're willing to follow whatever. If science was demonstrating that evolution was true, that's what you would accept as the way that God did it.
right, because I'm allowing for secondary causes, full-blown, full-throated secondary causes, which means God used naturalism. And if that's what God wants to do, and I mean, there you can find verses in Genesis 1 which sound a lot like evolution. Let the earth bring forth. Let the earth bring forth. Wow, like that sounds like evolution to me. Now, it doesn't say that all through. There are other verses, so it's you get a smattering, but it does say that in a couple of places. So. And the earth is a day is as 1,000 years. You got that. There's definitely some interesting things going on there. I do think that the Bible is clear on that God is involved in the world, and God intended for this world, and that is anti-creationism. And so, at least, there are different threads, different flavors of creationism. So I shouldn't generalize too much here, but the broad, culturally accepted, culturally known creationism that we think of, coming out of Kentucky, San Diego, Australia, Nexus is, that sort of creationism, will say, no, God did not intend for this world. And so I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
So that's a whole nother discussion. We tend to get off on tangents here.
I know. And there's some good comments. Do you want me to put them up? Then you can respond to them. A lot of them are from Andrew. And I think, Andrew, thank you for putting good objections and comments. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah, let's give it a little bit and see how far we can go here.
So he says, this is going all the way back to the beginning. I'm going back to the top of, oh, wait. Oh, my gosh. No, this is the beginning. They're not different across species. They're different across the 3 domains of life. This is also ignoring all of the other major biochemical pathways that are conserved, such as those for protein synthesis.
So if they're different across different kingdoms, then they are different across different species. So that's not a distinction there. So when you say it's different across different species, that's true if it's different, if they are different across different kingdoms. So I'm not gonna, let's get off of the semantics here. The second part of that comment was that's ignoring the protein synthesis similarities that are conserved, that fulfill the prediction. So a couple of problems there, Andrew. One is you cannot take a false prediction and find instances where it's true and say, well, it's okay then. So if I make a prediction and it's false half the time. It doesn't matter that it's true half the time. It's false half the time. That's what counts. You know, if I dropped this pen and it floated in midair, you wouldn't say, well, ignore that because, you know, usually they fall. No, that's hugely important. If this thing hovered in midair, that would be important. So you don't want to be a protectionist. This is theory protectionism. When you say, well, it's, you know, it was true sometimes. Well, so what? That doesn't matter. If it's false one time, that's important. That's important. If it's, now this is false way more than one time. My last comment on that is, you said protein synthesis. No, protein synthesis is not conserved. That was the whole point of the DNA code. The DNA code, the amino acid tRNA synthetases are not conserved. They are different. Proteins themselves are wildly different across species. Yes, there are similarities in protein synthesis. That's true. So anyway, that's my response to that comment.
Okay, Jordan says, if there's water in our solar system and innumerable solar systems in the universe, why should we believe we are alone? Maybe Luca came from outer space.
Okay, interesting comment about ETs and the plurality of worlds. I agree. Yeah, why should we believe that we are alone? I don't believe. I don't mandate that. There are, of course, many different papers and hypotheses and calculations about what are the probabilities of life out there and extraterrestrials. And some of those calculations come up with there's reasonably good probability there are extraterrestrials. There are others that have come out to, you know, it's really unlikely. So they're kind of all over the map on that. But there are contemporary cosmologists and astronomers who say, no, it really doesn't look likely. It's all a crapshoot. These are difficult probabilities to come up with. But yeah, no, I don't see any cause to mandate that we are alone. I don't think that, I don't have a dog in that fight. I don't have a religious conviction. I don't have something in the Bible telling me, oh no, we have to be alone. I don't think that's biblical. So yeah, it's possible. Interesting comment.
Andrew says, tell me how you could test the existence of gods or ghosts, and then I'll retract that statement. And he was saying, I'll retract this statement. Naturalism is the core of all science.
Yeah. So you're getting into religious arguments. You know, he wants to have, I don't get into, I'm not going to, you know, what was his point? Disprove, have a falsification criteria for God. Is that what it was?
Well, yeah, he said, you could tell me how you could test the existence of gods or ghosts. Yeah. And then he'll retract the statement about naturalism. Like, he won't depend on naturalism if we could test the existence of gods or ghosts. This is something interesting. I really want to hear what you would say to this, because I feel like we can show our scientific observations can let us know that there is an intelligence behind life. But what do you think about that?
Well, so, you know, you get into God and theology and religion that has its own set of rules. It's very complicated. And we could talk about that. But science is easier to analyze. Science is man's project of figuring out how the world works. It has rules. It has, you know, logic behind it and so forth, mathematics. And so we have a claim. A claim has been made. There is a theory called the theory of evolution. Okay, fine. But there's a claim on that, which is that it's true or a fact or beyond all reasonable doubt, however you want to put it. Very, very high claim about a scientific theory. Now, that claim is a public claim. That doesn't have anything to do with any religious beliefs. It's a public claim open to public scrutiny. And the people who made that claim need to be vulnerable to criticism. They need to reckon with the science, with the empirical science. They need to reckon with that and acknowledge that their claim fails. So if you don't have an agreement, so when people like Andrew come along and say, well, I'm not going to give up on this unless you tell me that, you know, God, prove God or provide a falsification criteria for God or what, you know, whatever it is that you want. Okay, that's just that's changing the subject and diverting attention away from, you've made a claim, you've made a public claim, and it's false. And you need to acknowledge that. If you do not acknowledge that, that tells me, okay, you got cards you're not showing. You are under a deception, or you're under some sort of religious consideration or religious belief that mandates that you have to then have a. It has nothing to do with falsifying God or agreeing with it. This is not a test of God. This is a public claim of a scientific theory. If we cannot agree on that, if an evolutionist will not agree on the empirical evidence, then okay, we got problems. We have big problems here, and that's the case. Most evolutionists, very rarely will an evolutionist. I can't think of any who will acknowledge the false predictions and their implications and the failure to have a cause. There's no plausible cause. Evolution does not have a plausible cause, as the mathematicians in 1967 at the Wistar Institute argued. There's no plausible cause. It's just gotten worse since 1967. So evolution does not have a plausible cause for the origin of species. They are constantly, bitterly arguing and there's a proliferation of theories because it's not working. And you have this spawning of dozens and dozens of false predictions, fundamental false predictions. So you got a problematic theory, and a problematic theory, if you're going to adhere to that and you're going to mandate, I'm not going to drop this theory unless I get a falsification criteria for God. Okay, we're in a different type of argument here. This is a different kind of discussion. This isn't science anymore. We're not in Kansas here. And what I want to make people aware of is the scientific failure of evolutionary theory, if you look at it from a scientific perspective, and then why there is a theology driving it, and how that's the heavy lift. That's doing the heavy lifting. That's the cards that aren't being shown typically. So there's an enormous deception going on. Now, if evolution will say, yeah, okay, yeah, I got it. You got false predictions. You got a failure of the theory. The claim that it's a fact is not true. That's a false claim. I got it. I agree with that. But I still want to talk about, the Bible, or I want to talk about God, or I want to talk about your falsification. Okay, fine. Let's have that discussion. But I'm not against having these discussions. But if I can't get clarity on something that's easy, straightforward, then we're operating in a haze here. I'm working with someone who won't agree with what's easy. Then what's the point of having a discussion that's much more complicated and difficult? And so I like to try and get the science straightened out.
Well, I want to hear how you respond to this. So I hope it's not bothering you, because some of these things are like the things that people are bringing up all the time. I hear this all the time. Let me give you my answer, and then I want you to say your answer. But Andrew says, yes, completely unfalsifiable theories are bad, but biological evolution absolutely has bounds. The classic rabbit in the Cambrian layers, for example. So every time I say, look, what could falsify evolution? Oh, that would be easy. Just find a rabbit in the Cambrian. And I'm like, but we've already found all kinds of things that don't match up with the timeline, and they just changed the timeline. And so it seems like no matter what is found, they're able to adjust. I mean, I just saw them adjust the timeline by 40 million years for tetrapod evolution based on some tracks that they found a few years ago. So what is your response to that, Dr. Hunter?
Yep, you're good. Thank you, Rebekah. Yeah, the rabbit in the Cambrian argument. So my response would be a couple things. I call this naive falsificationism. So for a theory, you can always come up with a ridiculously low probability, no way that this is going to happen, as your falsification criteria. Oh yeah, we would be completely false if you found a rabbit in the Cambrian, something that is not at all characteristic of the geological strata and is not going to happen. And so you can just, state that, you find that. Meanwhile, as you pointed out, there are all kinds of predictions that have come out to be false. Dozens of fundamental, important predictions. This is not tangential stuff. This is core to the theory, or at least, core to the scientific part of the theory, that have come out to be false. And so instead of erecting a naive falsificationism, so what philosophers of science have pointed out is predictions need to be realistic, and they need to be vulnerable. They need to be actually something that could go wrong. You can't erect falsification predictions that are highly unlikely to go wrong as realistic tests of the theory. And so we have all kinds of good predictions that evolutionists have made over the years, over the decades, centuries, that have turned out to be false. So why ignore those and bring up a naive falsificationism of something that is just super unlikely as your test? So like, evolution is true because there's no rabbits in the deep down in the strata. It's just not a good test of the theory. And what's really going on here is theory protectionism, which is caustic to science. As Mr. Nelson taught you in your 7th grade science class, theory protectionism is really caustic to science. You don't want to be in the position of protecting a theory. You want to be in the position of being open to criticism, open to failure, and even exploring the failures yourself. And I think this is a lousy theory. This thing fails. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's what's necessary for science. We were always taught, scientists are by nature skeptical. They're very skeptical people. No, they're not. They're not at all skeptical. They're conservative. They stick to the paradigm, and they avoid and they sweep problems under the rug. That's a bad thing. They should be skeptical. That's a virtue. It's not a reality. So let's get back to that virtue. You don't want to be erecting things. Like, drop the whole, evolution is true shtick, and criticisms have to be false. Try and have an open mind, and just to the possibilities here, and to reckon with the actual empirical science genuinely.
And from what I know of Andrew, I think there might be potential there. I think that Andrew might be able to think that way. Wesley, I had to put this up.
And just before you go to Wesley, just let me point out, my comments are not specifically directed at Andrew. He tickles the thinking in my mind, but I'm talking to, I've spoken with hundreds, probably thousands of evolutionists over the years. I've debated so many. And so I'm talking to the generic, evolution, because these arguments just come up over and over and over again. So Andrew, I don't mean to be picking on you. I'm talking generically, but go on to Wesley.
Yes, thank you. So Wesley says creation is true because there are no teapots on Mars. If evolutionists could find a teapot on Mars, that would disprove creation.
Exactly. I love it.
Yes. Okay, so I think that's about all of the questions. There are other questions, but I think we've kind of covered it. So was there anything else that you wanted to share?
I don't think so. Thank you again, Rebekah. It's been a lovely Saturday morning here, and love the discussion. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll look forward to the next one.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Appreciate your support. This is a small channel. I hope it will grow, and I appreciate all of you who come and participate, and especially those who participate in spite of their strong disagreement with us, because I think it's great when you are willing to even listen to perspectives that are not your own. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you got to give credit to Andrew and the others who are even here to listen. That's great.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, everybody.